Okay, and how about related to kind of complaints and the situation there and how what steps they need to take?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because we're here this week through Medical Device Summit with FDA at the Recall and Risk Management Conference, and one of the overarching themes I'm hearing, again back to suppliers, is, well, if the supplier provides a component or a subassembly, Maria, that is part of a recall, which a recall can be either a correction or a removal, as you know, it doesn't have to mean removal. You know, what is the responsibility of the design owner and of the supplier, and how does the supplier get involved with the decision about the correction or removal? You know, what are the follow-up actions that the supplier is responsible for, and how do we drive that forward in a way that ensures consumer safety, patient safety, which ultimately is everyone's #1 concern. So when complaints come in, whether they require escalation or not, ensuring that we get timely feedback from our suppliers when they're not necessarily within our four walls, so that we can determine whether a medical device report is required, so that we can properly and thoroughly investigate that complaint. You know, these are all practical challenges that we struggle with, but the good news is there are best practices and methodologies that have been vetted out over time that are not only operationally efficient, but are regulatorily compliant as well, that we can implement.
And can you kind of briefly touch on maybe a couple of those best practices?
Well, sure. One that comes to mind right away, because it's something I'm working on now, is, you know, in the event that you need to reach out to your supplier and, for example, get some feedback regarding a material of construction that's used in a problematic or potentially problematic customer complaint, something that we're trying to decide, do we take field action, how do we report, how do we investigate, and do we escalate? And, you know, as we've all struggled with as manufacturers, when you reach out to your supplier, sometimes the response is timely, right? And sometimes it's not as timely as we would like, for any number of reasons. Particularly if those suppliers are maybe overseas, in different time zones, or maybe they don't have the answers that we need. And it can be difficult to get to the right person or to get the right level of technical detail. There are practices that we vetted whereby after, for example, multiple attempts, say if we have a procedure that documents, we'll make, say for example, 3 to 5 attempts to reach out to a supplier, and if we don't get the information that we need, what do we do then? Do we just forget about it? Of course not. What we can do is we can actually implement external testing to, even in the case of material characterization where you don't know the proprietary components, chemicals that go into a material. Maybe the supplier is responsive, but their response is, well, that's proprietary, I can't share that with you. What recourse do we have, and what are the regulatory bodies accepted? Well, we can do testing ourselves from HPLC, where we actually identify at a molecular level what the materials of construction are, to justifications on internal memoranda that become part of the quality record for why something based on a risk assessment may be appropriate to characterize only to an extent and not beyond that. If we can determine that it's not always necessary to know what the material is, as long as we know what it is not. And so using a risk-based approach and engineering rationales, we can often come up with a win-win that allows us to satisfy the regulatory requirement while still making our business solvent and operationally efficient, so that we're not calling, you know, for months trying to get an answer that we can't get.
All right, well, thank you so much for sharing your insight with us today.
It's my pleasure, Maria. It's great to be here.
Thank you.